find critical race theory interesting in how prevalent it is in the culture. It deals with the issue of how we come to knowledge. I despise it, but there are few ideas in the culture that explicitly has at its place epistemology. In essence, it takes perspective that a person's experiences, particularly those informed by their race, creates their own reality that cannot be understood outside of that racial identity. As far as I can tell, this is the current incarnation of the question, how do we know, for my generation? Taking all this into account, I've taken the arguments bounced around in my head against critical race theory and put them in this video. I'll go over the arguments in abstract and practice and some major considerations that I think are important. The simplified version of the argument. So, critical race theory believes that different experiences result in different truths or realities based on a person's racial experience, disregarding that consciousness has its own identity based on objective reality. They can skirt around reality that there is identity to our consciousness because the differences between the races are verifiably minuscule. However, if you can force the issue, then you can demonstrate that the perspective that experiences dictate reality is wrong. My way of forcing the issue is to expand the scope beyond race by bringing in sex. There is biological differences between men and women that inevitably create different experiences that would absolutely be unresolvable according to their argument. I can then demonstrate that the identity of human consciousness is that it is conceptual in nature. And this is what integrates what we observe of the genders, that despite having distinct differences, we operate on a conceptual level and can understand each other. So this is how I envision making this argument in practice. So there's a gap between the races that is unbridgeable, that the different experiences of individuals within a race results in different internal worlds that are incomprehensible and mutually exclusive to each other. This is false. There is no gap between the races because the identity of human consciousness is that we operate on a conceptual level. We abstract away the particulars of our experiences and understand the world in a conceptual manner that is not any different from each other. You may say this is a white perspective or a Western perspective or some other such nonsense. However, let's see how critical race theory fares when we expand the scope beyond race and apply it to sex. There is a good reason why a person's sex is not brought up, because following the same exact logic as critical race theory, men and women would be incapable of understanding each other due to their different experiences of the world. Look at the differences. We have different genetics, different organs, different hormones, different brain structures, and even differences in nerve density, which causes differing levels of pain. Regardless of whether or not we do the same exact things, our experiences would be different, making it impossible for us to understand each other. This is a nightmare. It would mean that we are never going to be able to understand each other. I ask myself, what would this personally mean for me? And what comes to mind is, let's say I fell in love with a woman. If I told her I loved her, I would have in the back of my mind that she could never experience the same love as me, because our experiences are different by the fact that I'm a man and she's a woman. She'll never be able to love me in the same way. And even so, there's no way for me to validate it. You can run the same thought experiment with your significant other, your father, your mother, your children. As I said, this is a nightmare. So how do we escape this mess? Well, the question of how we understand the world and come to knowledge is the field of epistemology. Quoting from the introduction to objectivist epistemology, a concept is a mental integration of two or more units possessing the same distinguishing characteristics, with the particular measurements omitted. Objectivist epistemology would have us abstract away the various experiences and internal reality that is advocated by critical race theory. In the same way, we have the concept of iron, which identifies a substance by a set of measurements and omits all the various forms it can take. So the same can be said about all concepts, including those that describe the internal state of understanding or love. In this way, we can see the conceptual nature of consciousness makes us capable of understanding each other, not only between the races but the sexes as well. End of argument. So while this argument is not very refined, I think it has strengths that are worth pointing out. The purpose of the argument is to expand the scope of integration beyond what critical race theorists are able to handle. They simultaneously have to come up with a plausible alternative to objectivist epistemology and refute that biological differences between men and women result in different experiences that would render them incapable of understanding each other. They can't do this. They are incapable of making integrations able to rectify these two separate points, while in contrast, objectivist epistemology is able to cover this wider scope of situations where critical race theorists fail, by having explanations to problems that the other party is incapable of addressing. It makes it much more likely to gain attention and change minds. Another big positive for this argument is that it provides value. In the case of this argument, I believe I'm releasing a massive amount of tension that is held within people. I personally found that when I understood objectivist epistemology, even to the limited degree that I do, I felt an enormous relief because I understood that people were equals in an epistemological sense. I did used to question whether or not it would even be possible for me to understand what a woman was feeling and vice versa, if something like love could ever be mutual. And this is what I mean by release of tension. Getting rid of this second guessing on whether or not concepts such as love or courage could even be understood between the genders is a value. It is a counter-offer to the perpetual state of non-comprehension that critical race theorists are trying to sell. This argument provides a degree of future-proofing. It does not knock out critical race theory, only have biological essentialism, racism fill the void. Any future authoritarian political ideology is going to have to first contend with avoiding stepping on this landmine, if that's even possible. It short-circuits entire swaths of ideologies, from traditionalist gender roles to ethno-nationalism, rendering them inert before they can even be made. In general, having people with a legitimate stake in proper epistemology will make it much harder for people to weasel in contradictions and easier to believe in proper arguments. In conclusion, I think that arguing against critical race theory can lead to long-term gain. This might be the best vector right now to inject proper epistemology into the culture. Long-term improvements in the culture will come if a percentage of the population becomes invested in proper epistemology. So yeah, let's fight this.